Hi everybody, me again. Now we're on to our second type of market structure, monopoly. This is the exact opposite of perfect competition. You kind of have that spectrum, perfect competition on one side, monopoly all the way on the other. The last two that we study will be somewhere in the middle, an amalgamation of the characteristics of the other two. So what's a monopoly? Maybe you've heard a lot about this. It's in the news quite a bit. Is Facebook a monopoly? Is Amazon a monopoly? All those things are being debated, and you'll have a chance in the discussions to voice your opinion about those. I look forward to reading it. But let's go through starting with the characteristics, just like we did with perfect competition, and you'll notice these are opposites. So one firm, not many firms, many buyers and sellers, like perfect competition, just one firm. And then there are no close substitutes for the monopoly's product, its good or service, and that's partly why there's just this one firm. Again, very different than perfect competition. There are significant barriers to entry. And what that means is it's not like when there are profits that a firm can just enter in the long run. And what are these barriers? Your book goes through this. It can be things like a patent or copyright. It could be the fact that maybe this is the resource that's used to make the good or service or part of the product is owned only by this firm. So, for example, classic one is De Beers and Diamonds. Or it could be something with the cost structure, that there's such high fixed costs to get in that it's really hard for other firms to enter and compete, and that's kind of like a natural monopoly. So the barriers to entry is going to directly affect this idea of profits in the long run. Remember, with perfect competition, because firms could enter or even exit, that drove profits down to zero economic profits, right, which includes covering opportunity costs. So zero economic profits isn't necessarily a bad thing. You're just covering the cost of your next best alternative. With this type of market structure, there can be long-run profits. Long-run economic profits. And this firm clearly has some market power and control over price, so we call them a price maker. Okay, so let's take a look at what this looks like. And because there's just one firm, the firm is the market. So voila, there's not two axes anymore. There's not an industry and a firm. There's just one monopoly. And right away, hopefully you notice the cost curves look similar. J-shaped marginal cost, the bowl-shaped average total cost curve. What you'll notice is there's a downward sloping demand curve. That's like our market demand that we've seen. That, in fact, is the market demand curve. That law of demand, where high price means relative lower quantity, that inverse relationship. That wasn't what a firm in a perfectly competitive market faced because they were a price taker. This firm is a price maker. It is the market. They are subject to the law of demand. And what that means then is there will be a separate marginal revenue curve that's actually lower than the market demand curve. Remember, in a perfectly competitive world, the marginal revenue curve was the demand curve, because every time the firm wanted to produce another unit, the additional revenue that it got was actually that exact price that was set in the market. In this case, the marginal revenue is lower because if the firm wants to sell another unit, it must actually obey the law of demand and reduce the price of that next unit, that downward sloping demand curve. Okay, so now what we want to do is understand how this firm makes decisions about what to produce, how to profit maximize. And we need to go through our 5 steps again. And so here they are. Hopefully they're looking familiar. First step, marginal revenue equals marginal cost. It's going to be a little bit more complex. Find your marginal cost curve and find the marginal revenue downward sloping curve. Where do they intersect? Right there. They make an X. Step 2, go down to the quantity axis, find the output that corresponds to where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Step 3, so all the steps are the same, they're just a little bit different axes, the curves are a little different, the lines are a little different. Step 3, from this optimal quantity, go up to see what price will be charged. And the key insight here is you go all the way up to the demand curve, and then go left to read what price that corresponds to. Why do you go all the way up to the demand curve? Because this firm is the market and they can charge what the market will bear. And what the market will bear is given to us based on the demand curve. So for this quantity, the most this monopolist can charge is what the demand curve tells us. In this case, it's 30. Step 4, compare that price that they're getting to what it's costing them, their average total cost at that unit. So at 50, go up and see what the average total cost is. That's step 4. And you'll see right there, and then read across and see, oh, it's 20. So their profit margin is the difference between the price they're getting, 30, and their average total cost at that unit that they're producing of 50, which is 20. And then calculate the profit. That's step 5. So step 5 is telling us we want to know the area of this box. And this box is going to be the height, so that's price minus average total cost, 30 minus 20, times the length, which is the quantity, which is 50. So what is that? 10 times 50 should be 500. Check me on that. Okay, so this can continue from the short run into the long run. There's no firms that are going to enter. Why? Barriers to entry. Okay, so then you might be wondering, can this firm have a loss? Yeah, it can have a loss, and what would that look like? Of course, they're not going to want to stick around if there is a loss, and they'll go through that same decision about, should I leave or how can I minimize losses? But just for inquiring minds, how does it look on the graph? If there's a loss, it means that once you find the profit maximizing optimal quantity, again, which is 50 here, marginal cost equals marginal revenue, go down to the quantity. When you go up to compare price to average total cost, it's that the average total cost is greater at that optimal quantity. And that's why there's a loss. I'm calling it a profit here. It's really a negative profit or a loss. It would be the price, 35, minus that higher average total cost at that quantity of 40, times the quantity that's being produced, 50, so you get 250, if I've done my math correctly, which I think I have. Another important insight to think about with monopoly is how does this compare then to perfect competition? So we talked a lot about how perfect competition is very efficient. I think you guys probably can guess this is not efficient. We don't like it when there's market power. When there's only one firm in the market, they have control. They can raise the price. We don't have anywhere else to go to buy that good or service. That's why there's regulators look at, is there too much market power? Do we need to protect consumers? So let's just use some of our economic tools, and we can say that monopolies are definitely more inefficient. And what we can look at is, here's what it looked like at the competitive, perfectly competitive market. There was the market curve, right? That's what we want to compare to a monopoly firm because that's the market. And we maximized our total surplus and had allocative efficiency. When you look at a monopoly, if you take a look, the downward sloping demand curve, because there's a marginal revenue curve that's lower, we can consider the supply curve as essentially the same thing as their marginal cost curve. Firm's not going to supply something unless they actually have additional costs being covered. So the supply curve, think of it as the marginal cost curve. And this is just for comparison purposes. What do you see? You'll produce here at this quantity of monopoly, and when you go up to the demand curve and figure out the price, oops, sorry about that, you will have deadweight loss. There it is. So because there's deadweight loss, monopoly is not getting the maximum total surplus and is creating inefficiencies. There will be a higher price and a lower quantity that's being produced. All right, that's monopoly. Good luck going on to the next step.